We have explored some remains of Roman-era Paris in a previous walk, but this part of Paris is far too lovely to be wrapped up in a Roman toga and put away for long-term storage. Today, let's visit some splendid churches in the quarter. At the end, we'll stop by for some excellent couscous. My eyes were even bigger than my stomach. After that, we'll swing by my favorite street creperie over by the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, here on the Armchair Traveler. Welcome to the Armchair Traveler 2022. I travel, observe, talk, read, and write. My blog will give you city walks, deep dives, and practical information and tips for the solo traveler and everyone. Our first stop today will be on Ile de la Cité, close to where we wrapped up in an earlier blog for lunch. We'll start with Notre Dame de Paris, now closed for major rebuilding after a disastrous fire. This photo shows one of the famous rose windows, the rounded arch, the fabulous flying buttresses, and the two bell towers. It also disguises one simultaneously tragic and truly disturbing fact. The initial fire warnings were ignored and the fire suppression system failed completely. In the year before the fire, 13 million people visited the cathedral, and that doesn't count the folk for whom this was actually a parish church. Anyone in history who was or wanted to pretend he was a someone made an appearance here. Kings were crowned, queens were crowned, saints were interred, politics was committed as well. Even Napoleon got in on the act. He pitched up a huge circus tent here at the apse inn of the cathedral to shelter guests arriving by coach. You can just make out the coach inside this tent. Although he chose, at least in this portrait, to arrive heroically, in public relation terms, on horseback. As far as I know, when Hitler did his victory lap in Paris, he spent considerable time visiting and communing with Napoleon I, with whom he compared himself quite favorably. He didn't bother with the cathedral. He apparently did order that all of beautiful Paris, presumably including the cathedral, was to be blown to smithereens before it was allowed to fall to the enemy. Hitler then returned to his plans for a cockamamie new capital to be built on present-day Berlin, which he was going to call Germania. Fortunately for history and for the city, the Allies ended the war before anyone managed to carry these orders out. Unfortunately, while the cathedral escaped Hitler's clutches, it turned out not to be fireproof. In the last image, we saw Napoleon headed inside of Notre Dame. He was there to be crowned as Emperor Napoleon. This is Jacques-Louis David's interpretation of the already crowned Emperor Napoleon I proceeding to crown his wife, the soon-to-be discarded Josephine, as Empress. The man in the background is Pope Pius VII. In a way, Napoleon was responsible for Pius becoming Pope in the first place. In 1798, during the French Revolutionary Wars, French troops under Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Rome, captured the then Pope Pius VI, took him prisoner, and hauled him to France, where he died the next year. Another man was elected as Pope and took the name as Pope Pius VII. The story of Pius VII reminds us you can't ever afford to compromise and appease an aggressor. Pius tried to take a cautious approach to Napoleon, going so far as to agree to crown him as emperor. In 1809, however, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon once again invaded the Papal States, resulting in his being excommunicated by the Pope. Pius was then taken prisoner and transported to France, just as his predecessor had been. In his case, however, he survived for 5 years. After the French were defeated, he was permitted to return to Rome, where he was warmly greeted as a hero and a defender of the faith. The fact that all of this happened because he refused to stand up to Napoleon in the first place seems to have been lost to history. On April 15, 2019, at around 6 o'clock local time, fire broke out in the attic of Notre Dame Cathedral. Across the Seine, a friend of mine was sitting at Le Depart Saint-Michel, a bar brasserie I know well from forever ago. She was sitting there nursing a café noir and basically resting her feet. She eventually heard the sirens and saw the flames on the roof. It took a while, actually quite a long while, before anyone outside the cathedral even knew it was on fire. The local guardians had silenced the alarm and went to see for themselves instead of putting out screams for help. This clever image shows you the cathedral before the fire and just after the flames were extinguished. The scaffolding you see above the rose window was there because workers were repairing the roof. The scaffolding survived, at least in part. The famous spire and most of the roof did not. Although we cannot go inside the cathedral, and there is no certainty on when I will ever get back inside, or even if this particular piece of stained glass survives, I do want you to see it. This is a 19th century piece which shows Saint Genevieve praying to stop the rain from ruining the harvest. Genevieve is the patron saint of the city. We'll come back and talk about her a bit at the end of our walk. One of the many fun parts of strolling along the Seine River is walking past the bouquinistes. They operate out of small green trunks securely bolted to the sidewalks along sections of the streets on either side of the Seine. Although technically they only are supposed to sell books and antiques, there are plenty of other things on offer, as you can see in this photograph. This is one of the famous Art Nouveau entryways to the Paris Metro, in this case at the Place Saint-Michel. These beauties, which fortunately no one has ever been willing to tear down, were designed by French architect Hector Guimard at the turn of the 20th century. Once you cross over the Seine River, if you pick the right bridge, you'll arrive in the 5th arrondissement, also known as the Latin Quarter. Here you will be confronted by dozens, if not hundreds of college students on the hunt for breakfast, lunch, and books. There are several excellent French-language bookstores nearby, as well as many bars, brasseries, and restaurants. There's also the fountain at the Place Saint-Michel, where you will always be able to find, at least in hot weather, tourists and students alike cooling their feet in the fountain water. I've always enjoyed this slightly ditzy memorial and fountain. The fountain looks exactly like what it is, a piece of art created by a committee. It was finally completed in 1860. 9 major sculptors participated, along with the lead designer. At one point during the design process, the plan was to have the central figure depict Napoleon Bonaparte, but that plan came under criticism from opponents of then Napoleon III. It was finally decided that the fountain should be an image of Saint Michel the Archangel, along with 2 dragons that spout water into the fountain. Here's a detailed view showing you St. Michael with the sword in his hand, apparently slaying a dragon. Michael was an archangel and is recognized by pretty much all faiths as such. He is always portrayed slaying the dragon. Michael and St. George became the patron saints of chivalry and are now considered to be the patron saints of police officers, paramedics, and the military. This lovely old church was named after a hermit called Severin. Severin lived on the site and died here sometime in the 6th century AD. His Latin name would have been Severinus. He was born in Burgundy. The story is that he released King Clovis from some unspecified horrible disease that his doctors had been unable to cure. He is also said to have performed other miracles before his death. In Severin's day, this area was pretty unattractive, so no one objected to his moving here and building a cell and living and dying on the spot. Like most medieval churches, this one spent a very long time gestating into its current form and went through several changes in style. After Severin died, the local authorities built a chapel on the site of his cell. That chapel was destroyed during the Norman invasions in the 9th century, then rebuilt in Romanesque style in the 11th century. Over time, as the University of Paris grew, the Romanesque church proved to be too small. The present Gothic building began construction in 1230. There was a fire and the church was rebuilt between the 15th and 17th centuries in the current flamboyant Gothic high style. What is flamboyant? In English, we might call it Gothic flamboyant, and it means exactly what it sounds like, extremely showy architectural details meant to emphasize rather than to disguise the underlying architecture. The church is mostly Gothic, as you can see from the arches and vaulting on the left, but at the apse end now boasts these twisted pillars. To me, they look a lot like palm trees and remind me that styles come and go and then come back again sometimes. Antoni Gaudi's La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona is essentially neo-Gothic and has similar pillars. This very old church began service as a Catholic place of worship. Depending on how you count it, it is the oldest church in Paris, parts of which actually date from the 9th century, although mostly it was built in the 11th and 12th century in Romanesque styles. It was later on modified into Gothic. It was further modified in the 19th century and converted into a Greek Orthodox basilica. This section of the interior on the left shows how the church moved on from Romanesque to Gothic style. Notice the arches and the vaulting. On the right you see an iconostasis, or icon stand, which was installed in the church when it was converted to Greek Orthodox use. The iconostasis represents one of the most important architectural features in Orthodox churches. It amounts to an unbroken screen of icons separating the sanctuary, where the sacrament of the Eucharist is celebrated, and the central part of the nave, where the congregation stands. Julian apparently got around and did some pretty awful things before he saw the light and became a saint. He was said to have had powers of some variety or another, and was credited with curing one of the Merovingian kings who controlled the area of some awful disease. The king was named Chilperic and rewarded him handsomely. Julian got money, a rich wife, and a castle. He was living large. One day he was out hunting, and he was reproached by a deer he had shot with an arrow, who told him that one day he would kill his own mother and father. Julian apparently never gave up deer hunting. One day he was out and about, and his mother and father arrived at the castle. When his wife realized who they were, she put them up for the night in their own bedroom. Julian returned unexpectedly that night and saw a man and woman in his bed. He suspected the worst and killed them both. I'm not at all sure what he suspected, but it might have been that he thought some other guy was bedding his wife. When the wife returned from church, he looked at her, at the corpses, and realized he had murdered his own parents. Julian was said to be overcome with remorse, or possibly guilt and fear, and fled the castle. He resolved to do penance. He was joined by his blameless wife, and together they built an inn for travelers, as well as a hospital for the poor. He was forgiven his crime when he gave help to a leper in his own bed. The leper, the story goes, turned out to be a messenger from God who had been sent to test him. Julian remains the patron saint of hotel keepers, travelers, and boatmen, which is why you see him here perched in a boat. The pediment above the main door shows the martyrdom of Saint Stephen, after whom the church is named. However, this is also said to be the resting place of Saint Genevieve. The figure standing in the lower right is that saint herself, who's usually shown with a sheaf of wheat, though not in this depiction. In 451, what is now northern France was in the grip of a furious struggle. In Paris, one side had its defenders, the Celts and the Romans. On the offense was Attila and his Huns, headed in the general direction of Paris by two very different routes, one coming in from the north, one from the east, as you can see on this map. The little red flames you see on the map indicate cities that the horde had conquered and sacked. They destroyed everything and everyone in their path. Attila and his Huns had gotten as far as Beauvais, more or less to the north of Paris, and Reims to the east, and he had demolished and sacked east. They were clearly headed south, and Paris stood in their way. Enter a former peasant girl, now a pious nun called Genevieve. She was apparently a real person. She had visions which she interpreted as messages from God. She also has several miracles in her basket of attributes. The story goes that she was a farm girl and a shepherdess, which is why she is sometimes depicted with a sheep, as she is on the statue outside this church. Genevieve's first miracle occurred in 451, when Attila and his Huns were headed in the direction of her city. The city's Christian defenders heard what the horde had done in other cities and were making plans to bug out. When Genevieve got wind of she led a prayer marathon, telling the men that if they just hung in there, Attila would go elsewhere. She convinced them. Maybe Attila heard the story and sensed that there were easier pickings elsewhere and diverted. Maybe he didn't think Paris was worth the effort. No one really knows the truth anymore. What we do know is that her reported bravery and bucking up of the troops did the trick. The city's escape from Attila proved a short-lived reprieve, as it was attacked and later overrun in 464 by Childeric I. His son Clovis made the city his capital in 506. Genevieve saved the city this time again. The prolonged siege created a serious food shortage that brought the citizens to the starvation point. One night, she led 11 boats out onto the river, rowing past the enemy's siege lines. Once safely across, she went from village to village begging for food. Later that night, she returned to Paris, again slipping safely past the blockade with boats full of precious grain. Genevieve, this time in the form of a blockade runner, had saved the city. Her third miracle, I couldn't find a date for one, but it does show up in the window in Notre Dame that I showed you earlier, also involved prayer. The city was again being threatened by famine, this time by unceasing rain during what should have been the harvest. Genevieve put her hands together and implored God to end the rains, and in some artwork her prayers were answered by an angel stopping the water carrier from dumping her bucket of water on the city. Genevieve led a long and pious life and finally died at nearly age 90. Death didn't put an end to the pious nun's assistance to the city, however. In 1129, a violent fever swept through the city. Doctors couldn't stop people from dying. The shrine of Genevieve was carried in a procession to the cathedral, and during the ceremony, those who touched the shrine were healed by the power of the Lord. Throughout the whole time, no one else became sick, and the ill recovered, and only 3 people died. Unfortunately, during the French Revolution in 1793, her body was burned on the Place de Grève. The relics were later moved here to Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. For all this, she will forever be the patron saint of Paris. On the left, we see an image of the lovely main aisle of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, complete with a rood screen and an elaborate pulpit. I've added a detail of the base of the pulpit for you on the right. My affection for this church dates from 1970, not just because it was the very first Catholic church this flatlander from Indiana had ever entered, but it was the first church I visited in Paris as a 20-year-old college student back in 1970. I go back every time I'm in the city, and I always leave a small donation to help defray the costs of keeping the church open to the public. Whether an iconostasis, like we saw back at Saint Julien Le Pauvre, or a rood screen, which we see here, the purpose was the same, to separate the holy from the lowly. Perhaps the most unusual feature of the church, aside from the monument to Saint Genevieve, is the rood screen, created in about 1530. This is the only remaining sample in Paris. It's an elaborate sculptural screen which separates the nave from the choir. The screen was used as a platform to read the scripture to ordinary parishioners. They were very common in the Middle Ages, but were largely abolished in the 17th and 18th century under a decree of the Council of Trent, which aimed at making the ceremonies in the choir more visible to ordinary parishioners in the nave. We've seen quite a bit today, so I think it's high time we saw the inside of a restaurant for some refreshments. I dined here at Le Méchoui du Prince, and it was excellent. The name Méchoui means lamb kebabs. I only later found out that the restaurant has been here for half a century. I thought highly enough of this restaurant to review it on Google. Since my review describes exactly what you see in the photos, I'll read it to you. This Moroccan restaurant deserves far more love than it gets. I learned how to make a proper Moroccan couscous, so I can vouch for this place. It has an extremely pleasant setting near the Luxembourg Gardens. I ordered the prix fixe menu and a small pitcher of rosé wine. The menu included a kind of spread made of peeled chopped red and yellow peppers, olive oil, and secret spices to spread on the bread. It was excellent. The main course was couscous mixed, probably enough for 2, with the couscous grain, the soup component. If a cook bungles this part, there is no recovery, along with sausage, a beef skewer, and a grilled lamb chop on the side, plus a really big bottle of cold tap water. My recommendation is if you go here, go hungry. I added on the following. It also has extremely clean bathrooms, but it's down a turnpike stairwell. Into every life some sin, in the form of chocolate, must enter. I had passed up dessert at our last stop and began wandering in the general direction of the Seine. I was ready for dessert. I've been coming to this same creperie every time I've been in Paris for at least the last 25 years. I never get further into it than a Nutella crepe, although they do make many other varieties. Sadly, I've read some reviews which suggest that quality has declined since the pandemic. I'm hoping that that is a temporary effect. I will scope it out next time I'm in Paris and let you know. I hope you enjoyed your visit today on the Armchair Traveler. If you found this video interesting or helpful, please give it a like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It's free to you, but it will help the channel grow. Travel sites in history can be word-heavy, especially background information, so some of my video blogs have companion pieces with more for you. There are also pieces which don't make it into video format at all. You can check them out on my WordPress blog site. The address is armchairtraveler2022.wordpress.com. If you'd like to keep up when I post new blogs or video blogs or are interested in tweet-sized posts, follow me on Twitter. My handle there is @armchair2022. I will tweet updates for new posts, and when I begin traveling again, will take you along in short form on Twitter.